time to bring to a close the travel diary of my first trip to Europe. And what a trip it was. One of the first things I did when I enrolled as a freshman at the State University of Iowa 3 years ago was attend tryouts for the Scottish Highlanders. At the time, I never dreamed it would lead to an adventure like this one, an unforgettable 9-week tour of Europe. Traveling on the continent and in the British Isles would be thrill enough, but in the company of 71 other University of Iowa Highlanders, it was an experience which none of us will ever forget. Perhaps it took a trip to Europe to make us realize what belonging to a group like the Scottish Highlanders really means.
Belonging to the State University of Iowa Scottish Highlanders means a great many things. It means membership in the largest drum and bagpipe band in the world. It means performing in the State University of Iowa Stadium at Big Ten football games every fall. It means fostering respect for Scottish music, traditions, and customs in this country. To the Highlanders, their tour in the summer of 1956 was a chance to gain a better understanding of people in other countries. And in representing their university, their state, and their nation as unofficial ambassadors of goodwill, the Highlanders helped bring a better understanding of America to 7 foreign lands. Although the group that toured Europe was exclusively feminine, this wasn't always the case. The band was organized in 1935 as an all-male military unit and remained so until 1943, when World War II took the men from the Iowa campus. Then the co-eds took over the organization, and it looks like they'll never give it back. A 10,000-mile trip for 80 persons requires months of planning and preparation. And the man responsible for it was Highlander director William L. Adamson, who for 20 years has directed the group. The problems of lodging, food, and transportation for the proposed trip were not new to Bill Adamson. 4 years previously, he'd taken a similar group of Highlanders on a European tour, and they were so popular that he had many requests to bring his unusual pipe band back to England and Scotland once again. It was such a wonderful opportunity for education and sightseeing that the girls were more than willing to pay their own travel expenses. But in true Scottish fashion, they warned Bill that he must shop for the best bargains he could find in transatlantic transportation. Suddenly, the months of planning were ended. It was time for the Iowa co-eds to start their great adventure.
Washington, the first of 14 major cities on our itinerary. Bill lost no time in starting rehearsals for our performance for Iowa alumni in the shadow of the Washington Monument. We also had to get ready for our presentation in the Rose Garden of the White House. Our gifts for President and Mrs. Eisenhower were accepted by a presidential aide in the Eisenhower's absence. From the White House, we went to the British Embassy. Sir Roger and Lady Makins entertained us in the Embassy Gardens. Joe Shiley, our drum major, presented Sir Roger with a Schaefer pen desk set, a product of our home state of Iowa. The embassy provided our first preview of formal English gardens. And it's not every day a person has a British ambassador as her personal tour guide. Washington was impressive, but New York was even more fascinating if possible. New York was exciting, thrilling, tremendous. Everything we expected and more. During our 4 busy days there, we performed at City Hall for Mayor Wagner, saw Broadway plays, visited the United Nations, Radio City, Greenwich Village. We saw the sights, and we created one ourselves when we all walked up Broadway to appear on Ed Sullivan's nationwide television program. 25 million Americans saw our TV performance. Today we sail for Europe. It seems too good to be true.
The Iowa lassies were excited and more than a little overwhelmed by their first sight of the imposing ocean liner that would be their home for 5 days. They could hardly believe that anything as big as this sailing city could stay afloat. With typical co-ed curiosity, the girls from the University of Iowa explored the Queen Mary from bow to stern. And in no time at all, they felt completely at home on the giant Cunard liner. A chance to relax while waiting for sailing time was welcomed by the Highlanders after their busy whirl of sightseeing and performing in New York. Now they looked forward to the biggest thrill of all, visiting continental Europe and performing in Great Britain. They took a long last look at the New York skyline as the busy tugboats guided their ship into the harbor. After changing to civilian clothes like the other passengers, the Highlanders waved goodbye to the crowd on the Cunard Pier. The big adventure had finally begun. It was with mixed emotions that the lassies from Iowa stood at the rail watching the Statue of Liberty and the New York skyline fade into the horizon. But like typical American co-eds, they were soon engrossed in the excitement of shipboard life and the prospect of their arrival in a foreign country.
We set foot for the first time on foreign soil when the Queen Mary docked at Cherbourg, France, late in the afternoon.
The University of Iowa co-eds didn't stay in Cherbourg very long, for their train was ready to take them through France and Belgium and on to the Netherlands. Arriving at the Amsterdam station, the Iowa girls were pleasantly surprised to be met by two Dutch girls in native dress. Their friendly smiles made a common language seem unnecessary. A citywide strike of taxi drivers had hit the Netherlands' capital city, but rather than walk the 2 miles to their hotel, the Highlanders boarded water taxis to take them by way of Amsterdam's picturesque canals. And once again, the Iowa girls found themselves traveling by water, which they had come to enjoy by this time. The ride by motor launch was a quick and pleasant way to get acquainted with the city. As they traveled up and down its quiet canals, the Iowa girls could readily see why Amsterdam is called the Venice of the North. The land of windmills and wooden shoes enchanted Iowa's kilted co-eds, and a day's journey to quaint Marken Island took the girls to the Holland of yesterday. They were delighted with the native costumes which all 1,500 Marken Islanders wear every day. Their gaily colored costumes were enhanced even more by the colored wooden houses on the island. Marken Island, with its fishing fleet, was a sharp contrast to Amsterdam itself, which has been a center of world trade for centuries. Whether they were visiting the place where Rembrandt lived and worked, cruising through Amsterdam's many canals, or joining the thousands who bicycle along its quaint little streets, the Iowa Highlanders all came to realize why the first visit to Holland is seldom the last.
We left one picturesque country for another when we journeyed from Holland to Germany. The city of Cologne was our first stop. It was hard to believe that nearly 85% of the city had been leveled during World War II, since most of us were only 7 or 8 years old at that time. We found that post-war reconstruction was turning this one-time Roman colony into a beautiful modern city. We were happy, too, that the war had spared the historic Cologne Cathedral across the river.
Once again taking to water travel, the Iowa Highlanders chose a river steamer to travel from Cologne to Koblenz along Europe's most romantic highway, the Rhine River. Some of them admitted that this made them just a little homesick for the Mississippi and Missouri rivers bordering their native state. The leisurely cruise through the beautiful countryside was a pleasant contrast to the bustling city life of Cologne. The Highlanders could readily see why the Rhineland is Germany's pride, with its steep river banks providing scene after scene of breathtaking beauty. The vineyards on the sunny hillsides were heavily laden with grapes, which would soon be pressed into wine. And the towering old castles and fortresses overlooking the Rhine recalled the German history they had studied in their Western civilization classes back at the University of Iowa, which suddenly seemed many miles and and many centuries away. The 7-hour steamer cruise ended at Koblenz, another old city for the Iowa lassies to explore. The girls were thankful for the chairlift that saved climbing to the fortress of Ehrenbreitstein, high above the river. From this historic fortress, which was built in the 9th century, the Highlanders could see the entire city of Koblenz, nestling in the junction of the Moselle and Rhine rivers.
Much as we enjoyed our short visit to Germany, we were eager to be on our way to Paris. Who doesn't dream of seeing Paris with all its famous sights like the Eiffel Tower? Now that it was really happening to us, it was hard to know where to start. We knew our short week in Paris would fly, and we had so much to see and do. The view of the fascinating city from atop the Eiffel Tower took our breath away. From our vantage point, almost 1,000 feet above the city, we could see the places which we wanted to visit. It just wouldn't be Paris without the left bank and the little stalls along the Seine where books and paintings are sold. Where but in Paris would they have a majestic backdrop like Notre Dame Cathedral? Another truly impressive setting was the Sacré-Cœur de Montmartre, in whose shadow the sidewalk artists work. It was a wonderful opportunity to get a sketch made for the family back home. We spent many hours at the Louvre, the celebrated National Museum of France, viewing treasures like the Venus de Milo, Winged Victory, and Da Vinci's Mona Lisa. And the Garden of the Tuileries, which surrounds the Louvre, was itself a beautiful work of art. It was a good place to meet other sightseeing Highlanders, and a pleasant spot in which to relax after spending hours in the Louvre. We were having a wonderful time on the continent, meeting new friends and learning about their countries. We still looked forward to fulfilling our real purpose, performing in the land of the bagpipe, Scotland itself. But until that time arrived, we were determined to see everything in Paris. We were much impressed by the metro, the Parisian subway system which took us from place to place swiftly and economically. One of the less historic but very interesting spots in Paris is the world-famed flea market. After wandering among the hundreds of different booths, we decided that fleas are about the only commodity not sold in that second-hand bargainer's paradise. Our history books came alive as we viewed the Arc de Triomphe, built by Napoleon to commemorate the victories of his empire, and saw beneath it the eternal flame which marks the tomb of the unknown soldier. We loved walking down the Champs-Élysées, where we stored up a lifetime of memories. As our visit ended, we heartily agreed with the man who said, "Paris isn't a city, it's a world." Our carefree life as tourists on the continent went all too fast, and then it was time to board the Channel boat at Dieppe and sail for England. Soon we were docking at New Haven Harbor. Our first performance on British soil was in Plymouth, in the heart of romantic Devonshire County.
An unusual treat was in store for the Iowa girls when they performed in Plymouth, where they were escorted by a Scottish regimental band, the world-famous Sutherland and Argyll Highlanders. Here were some genuine Scottish Highlanders. The Iowa girls gave 2 performances in Plymouth to raise money for a hospital charity. As they marched across the historic Hoe at Plymouth, the Iowa students remembered that it was here where Sir Francis Drake calmly bowled while watching the Spanish Armada sail up the Channel, and that the Pilgrim Fathers had sailed from this historic town for the New World. Watching the Sutherland and Argyle band gave the Iowa girls a full-dress preview of the piping skill which the native Scots have mastered down through the centuries. Their busy day in Plymouth ended, and the kilted co-eds from Iowa went to London, where they were to give 3 performances before going to Scotland. Every minute counted. They had to look hard to find stately old Big Ben beneath all that scaffolding. When they weren't practicing or performing, the Iowa girls roamed the streets of historic old London town. And they wondered about the reception awaiting them in Scotland. How would the people of Edinburgh and Aberdeen take to a group of synthetic Scots from Iowa? They reminded themselves that the first contingent of Iowa Highlanders had received a warm welcome 4 years earlier. Still, they couldn't help but wonder, but they didn't let that apprehension spoil their fun.
Although we had 10 days to spend in fabulous London, we couldn't waste time if we expected to see everything. It seemed good to be back among people who spoke the same language as we did. Well, almost the same anyhow. And it was a pleasant change to walk down a street and not feel quite so much of a foreigner. We soon discovered that the bobbies who directed traffic on London's busy streets were a big help finding the places we wanted to see. Buckingham Palace was one of the first places we visited. We loved the precision with which the palace guards performed their traditional sentry duty, and we were truly amazed by a deep groove worn in the concrete through years of marching by the guards in the same path. We stopped at a small side street called Downing. The bobby outside the Prime Minister's residence at number 10 told us that top state officials were conferring inside about the Suez crisis. From there, we visited the Tower of London, one of the oldest landmarks in the city. We saw the crown jewels on display in this medieval fortress, built more than 900 years ago, and heard about the superstition that says the British Empire will fall when the ravens leave the Tower Green. We upheld one of London's most famous traditions when we fed the pigeons in Trafalgar Square. London must have the most overfed pigeons in the world. It was hard to believe that we had seen and done so much in the one short month since we had left New York. After the weeks of sightseeing, however, our feet welcomed a much-deserved rest, and they needed to be in good condition for the marching and performing we know we would be doing in Scotland. We left London and headed north. Scotland at last. Our first stop was at Edinburgh.
While they were in Edinburgh, the co-eds from Iowa saw Queen Elizabeth, who with Prince Philip was on hand to open the Edinburgh International Festival of Music and Drama. Thousands lined the streets to see the Queen, and among those thousands were all 72 Highlanders, anxious to get their first look at the royal couple. The Iowa co-eds left Edinburgh by bus to begin their 12-day tour of the Highlands. They knew this would be the most strenuous part of the entire trip, with 10 performances to present in the 6 Scottish cities which had invited them to visit. It would mean traveling by bus one day, performing the next, then traveling again. On their way to Glasgow, they drove through the picturesque Trossach mountain country. The famous Loch Lomond reflects the heathered hills. Having a native Scot for a guide made their visit complete. With countryside like that to look at, it was obvious why Scotland's rugged scenery has inspired so many songwriters and poets. After performing in Glasgow, the Iowa co-eds went on to Dundee and began rehearsing for their evening performance. Here, as in all other cities where they appeared, the girls received no money for performing. All money raised went to local charities. Cloudy skies, rain, and cold weather, which followed the Highlanders on most of their Scottish tour, began to plague them in Dundee. But it took more than bad weather to keep those hardy Iowa girls from performing as scheduled. After their short visit to Dundee, the group set out for northern Scotland. A long day of bus riding was broken by a visit to Glamis Castle, which gained fame as the setting for Shakespeare's play Macbeth. Aside from the literary and historic significance of Glamis, the girls learned that the picturesque castle was the childhood home of Queen Elizabeth and the birthplace of Princess Margaret. The Iowa girls were pleased when the Honorable David Bowes Lyon, a brother of the Queen Mother who lives in the castle, came out to greet them. This was something to write home about that evening.
Continuing through the Highlands, the wildest and most magnificent part of Scotland, we arrived at Inverness. Inverness, known as the capital of the Highlands, was full of the history and romance of Scotland. It was everything we thought a Scottish city should be, full of friendly people and delightful little shops where we could buy heavy sweaters and woolens. We paraded and performed 3 times while at Inverness, and were honored when the British Legion pipe band escorted us to the stadium where we performed. Perhaps it was our imagination, but just being in the Highlands at last seemed to help us perform at our very best. And the Scots were wonderful about teaching us how to improve our piping and drumming. We weren't trying to compete with the Scots, who have been playing bagpipes for centuries, but we were determined to do our best to prove that girls can march and play the pipes. We felt a little nervous at first performing on the same program with one of the best pipe bands in Scotland, but the friendly crowd soon made us feel at home. The members of the other band even seemed to enjoy our performance. We couldn't leave the Highlands without taking a trip to Glen Affric, not far from Inverness. It is one of the many narrow, secluded valleys in the wildest part of the Highlands. This colorful valley, which has remained almost completely unchanged during man's recorded time, was a stirring example of Scotland's rugged beauty. Nearing the end of the Scottish tour, we again boarded our special buses. A day's journey along the narrow country roads, which made traveling very slow, brought us to another northern city, Elgin. While in Elgin, we were pleased to be staying in Scottish homes instead of tourist hotels. It was a wonderful opportunity for us to really get to know the Scots, whose friendliness and generosity completely overwhelmed us. We invaded the many woolen mills and shops in the Elgin area, spending our few remaining pounds and shillings on tartans and other gifts for the folks back home. From Elgin, we went to Aberdeen, the last Scottish city we would visit before leaving the land of the heather and the haggis.
It was a big day in Aberdeen when the State University of Iowa's Scottish Highlanders arrived. This was the city which had taken the Highlanders of the 1952 trip to its heart, after being rather cool originally to the idea of a visit from synthetic Scots from Iowa. The girls had been a little apprehensive, wondering if the Aberdonians would be as cordial in 1956 as they had been in 1952. But the city's reception proved that their worries had been for nothing. The people of the Granite City lined the streets to welcome the Highlanders upon their arrival. As they had been in Elgin, the girls were entertained in the homes of Aberdeen families, many of whom were members of the Aberdeen, Iowa fraternity. This unique fraternity was actually a group of businessmen who had arranged the stay in Aberdeen. The reception by the friendly Aberdonians made the girls completely forget how tired they were as they neared the end of their 9 weeks in Europe. The Iowa girls were determined to give their best performances of their entire tour in this city, where they had been so warmly welcomed and where they already felt so much at home. And that meant an intensive practice at Lynxfield Stadium, where the performance was to be given that night. The cold wind blowing in off the North Sea near the stadium made those heavy uniforms feel awfully good, and some extra equipment as well. Lynxfield Stadium, known to the natives as the coldest spot in the British Isles, was colder and windier than usual when the hardy Highlanders marched onto the field that night. But the warmth of the Scottish audience made them soon forget the chill of the sea wind. As their performance ended, the audience spontaneously sang, "Will You No Come Back Again," the highest possible tribute to their Iowa visitors, who left midst cries of the Aberdeen motto of Bon Accord, happy to meet, sorry to part, happy to meet again.
From Scotland, we made our way to Southampton, where we found the Queen Elizabeth docked, waiting to take us back home. The voyage back to the States seemed slow to us, of course, for after 9 weeks of traveling on the continent and in Great Britain, we were eager to get home. But the leisurely trip was a good chance to rest and relax. In no time at all, we were pulling into New York Harbor and welcoming the sight of the Statue of Liberty. And the sign that greeted us as we got off the ship looked even better.
In just a few short days, the Highlanders were back on the Iowa campus, plunging into another year of classes and activities. With 12,000 miles of European travel behind them, they found a new fascination in studying about the world they live in, a world which they now knew much better. They performed again for the Big Ten football games in the University of Iowa Stadium, supporting a championship football team which led them to that New Year's Day classic, the Rose Bowl. It was a thrilling climax to a spectacular year for the 72 Scottish Highlanders. Within a few short months, they had toured the continent and Great Britain and crossed the United States from coast to coast. As unofficial ambassadors of goodwill, they made the state of Iowa and the State University of Iowa known to millions on 3 continents. And their reward was a host of priceless experiences which they will cherish forever.